My name is Paul Valone. Since 1994, I've directed Grassroots North Carolina, our state's primary gun rights organization. A few weeks ago, the New York Times published a disturbing claim by reporter Michael Luo that North Carolina concealed handgun permit holders include, in his words, more than 2,400 criminals, including, again, his words, more than 200 felons. He also maintains that sheriffs are failing to revoke concealed handgun permits from permit holders convicted of crimes. Now, Luo contacted me for the piece. We exchanged multiple phone conversations and perhaps 15 emails before he ultimately ignored everything I had to say. Now, given that Luo's assertions are likely to be the basis of legislation both in North Carolina and beyond, and given they are likely to be cited as factoids by gun control organizations, we should look not only at Luo's assertions, but at his history on the gun issue. First, anyone looking at Luo's work should know that this is not his first hit piece on guns. It is actually his fifth. His first centered on the audacity of gun show promoters to hold previously scheduled shows in Tucson after last year's shootings. The second carefully and deliberately selected studies to convey the impression that gun ownership increases rate of homicide. And it made a point of discounting the work of former U.S. Sentencing Commission Chief Economist John R. Lott, who's done extensive research on concealed handgun laws and determined that they actually deter violence. Of Lott, Luo said, quote, "Subsequent studies have found serious flaws with Dr. Lott's data and methodology." Yet Luo cites only one such case, one such study, omitting 18 that support Lott's conclusions. Now, in the third and fourth hit pieces, Luo gets on stride, lamenting in one that any of the more than 100,000 veterans who lost gun rights due to post-traumatic stress disorder might actually have the audacity to petition for the restoration of those rights. Later, he complains how easy it is for felons to get gun rights restored. In both of those, he uses exactly the same rhetorical tricks that he uses against concealed handgun permit holders. Namely, he leads with one or two scary anecdotes, murders or shootings, to convey the impression of a trend. Then he follows up with dubious science in order to give his article the patina of scientific authority. Then he cites a study or two that might tend to support his conclusion while utterly ignoring contrary research. And finally, he throws his hands up in objectivity, as he did recently on Twitter, to say data is the data, up to others to draw conclusions of significance. Perhaps Luo misunderstands the limits of his data. After all, on Facebook he confessed, quote, "made me wish I'd taken a stats class in college." But given 5 biased articles, blogger Francis Pareto said it best. When all the errors are in the bank's favor, you can be forgiven for thinking there's more at work than sloppy arithmetic. Now we get to Luo's masterpiece. In his article on North Carolina concealed handgun permit holders, he claims that in data spanning 5 years, he found, again his words, more than 2,400 of the state's 240,000 active permits were held by criminals, including more than 200 felons, 10 convicted of murder or manslaughter, of which, in his words, all but 2 used guns in their crimes, and including 900 convicted of driving while impaired. Well, that sounds pretty scary until you realize what he doesn't say. He says more than 2,400 because he doesn't know the real number. He claims to have done data matching between the state's concealed handgun database and its criminal database, but anyone who does data matching knows that that process can be fraught with error, potentially producing false positives depending on the number and the type of parameters matched. Our organization, for example, did a match between the concealed handgun permit database and the state voter database, and we found huge variation, anywhere between 46,000 and 234,000 matches depending on the parameters we selected. Now, because Social Security numbers for permit holders aren't available to the public, Luo matched only 4 parameters, and that include middle name matches, which even he says were not exact matches. In fact, according to data matching experts, given the small number of hits he produced, it's even plausible that the number of false positives exceeded real ones. So, given those uncertainties, we would expect Luo to verify his data with the State Bureau of Investigations, shouldn't we? But the fact is, he didn't. When I asked him how many of those matches he had verified, he demurred about a dozen. Now, he later upped that claim to, and again his words, maybe 20. Now, ignoring for a moment Luo's dubious data, let's look at those more than 2,400 criminals, including more than 200 felons. Now, that means that of those, 2,200 were convicted only of misdemeanors, which includes scores of infractions so minor or archaic that they don't even disqualify people from getting permits. Some examples of minor misdemeanors under North Carolina law, potentially included in Luo's 2,400 criminals, include hazing, public nuisance, graffiti, stealing milk crates, theft of cable TV, and my personal favorite, taking sea oats from the land of another. This was brought to Luo's attention by North Carolina gun blogger Sean Sorrentino. Now, Luo responded to Sorrentino and rationalized by saying, and I quote, "Just because the crimes committed by permit holders were not disqualifying doesn't mean they won't be something readers wouldn't care about." Yet another thing that Luo avoids highlighting is that even his own exaggerated data depict North Carolina permit holders as vastly more law-abiding than the general public. For example, if our overall homicide rate of 5.3 per 100,000 were applied to our 240,000 permit holders, we would expect them to commit roughly 13 homicides per year. Yet Luo found only 10 such cases over 5 years, a rate roughly 1/6 of what we would expect. Similarly, permit holders were only 1/8 as likely to commit DUIs or other felonies. Now, when Luo goes on to lament that sheriffs are failing to revoke concealed handgun permits from people convicted of crimes, he neglects mentioning something that I told him during the interview, namely that North Carolina concealed handgun permits are linked to driver's licenses, meaning that anytime someone is arrested, their de facto national identity card, the driver's license, tags them as a permit holder, giving law enforcement the tools they need to revoke permits when necessary. Luo does, however, cheerfully cite the support he received from Union County Sheriff Eddie Cathy, who in a recent news interview said, and I quote, "It's frightening, but that's the way the system has been set up from its conception." Well, of course, maybe most frightening of all should be Sheriff Cathy himself, since he was on the hot seat for failing to revoke the permit of someone who fired into a house containing one of Cathy's own deputies. Now, with respect to failure to revoke concealed handgun permits, Luo fails to ask the essential question. Of those people whose permits should have been revoked, how many actually went on to commit gun crimes? Here I'll defer to Dr. Lott, who said, and I quote, "The story couldn't identify a single such case over the 5 years that were studied." Ultimately, we may never know the extent to which Luo misleads on the concealed handgun issue. Why? Because he refuses to release his data. When I first asked for it, he dodged, saying instead, "I've been checking with the State Bureau of Investigation." When Sorrentino pushed him for it, he declined again, allowing that if you were a lawmaker, for instance, or a member of law enforcement, that would be a completely different matter. So next, a lawmaker asked him for the data, specifically the lawmaker who deals most with concealed handgun issues in the state of North Carolina. Yet Luo again dodged, saying, quote, "I've been asked by a long list of people for my data. My editors, though, as well as I, have been generally leery about releasing the data. We generally do not release unpublished work product," as though his final article were unpublished. Luo's other principal dodge has been to claim that others could do the data matching that he did. But of course that isn't true. Given the uncertainties of data matching and the fact that we don't know his exact methods, the chances of reproducing his results are infinitesimal. So in the end, the New York Times published a hit piece on concealed carry using dubious data they won't release, cherry-picking anecdotes to convey the impression of trends, and dismissing inconvenient research. When called to the carpet for his methods, Luo hides behind a fig leaf of objectivity, saying, and I quote, "I want to point out I was very, very careful in the story to avoid drawing conclusions." Now, I won't say that Michael Luo rises to the level of fabrication of another famous New York Times reporter, Jason Blair. Frankly, we may never know the level to which his misrepresentation will impact public policy with respect to concealed handgun laws. What seems clear, however, is Luo's mission to roll back the gains that Second Amendment supporters have made since the widespread and successful implementation of concealed handgun laws. Sometime soon, a gun control organization will cite a factoid that supposedly everybody knows based on one of Luo's misrepresentations. It'll be up to you to ensure that that factoid doesn't find a permanent place in public policy. Now, if you'd like to learn the truth about gun laws, you can check us out at Grassroots North Carolina at grnc.org. Thank you.